If you read the fantasy subreddit, you will know that Steven Erikson's Malazan series is frequently mentioned as one of the most complicated fantasy sagas ever written. Countless reviewers make the same complaints. Too many characters, difficult to follow, confusing. Well, I like a challenge, so I've read Book 1, Gardens of the Moon. And it's certainly a tough read, it's not for everyone, but by the end I really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the sequels. The first thing you should know is that this is not the sort of book you can just jump in and start reading, or you will be lost. There are two maps at the front, one of the continent of Genobakis, and another of the city of Darujistan, but you can just ignore them to start with, as the first 4 or 5 chapters take place on a completely different continent. The map for which is not included in this book, but you can find it online. The dramatis persona lists 85 characters, which is a lot, but only about a dozen of these are viewpoint characters. Some of them are only mentioned in passing, but you will need to keep referring back to this. I read this as an ebook, so I thought it would be easier to copy the character list down into a notebook for ease of reference. Now you may be wondering what the book is actually about. Well, it's a fantasy saga about the Malazan Empire, which has spent the past 100 years conquering much of the world where it is set. In the prologue, we witness some of the chaos that happens when the old emperor presumably dies, though it's far from clear what happened to him, and the new Empress Lacine takes over. It also introduces one of the main characters, a young nobleman called Ganos Paran. Most of the book takes place 9 years later, when the Empress has sent the Malazan army to conquer the continent of Genobakis, and you get a handy update on the state of the war so far. In the 8th year, the free cities of Genobakis established contracts with a number of mercenary armies to oppose the Imperium's advance. Prominent among these were the Crimson Guard, under the command of Prince Kaz Davor, and the Tistiandi regiments of Moonspawn, under the command of Kaldan Brood and others. The forces of the Malazan Empire, commanded by High Fist Dujek One Arm, consisted in that year of the 2nd, 5th and 6th armies, as well as legions of Moranth. The involvement of the sorceress Tistiandi of Moonspawn represented the beginning of the continent's sorcery enfilade, with devastating consequences. In the year of Burn Sleep 1163, the Siege of Pale ended with a now legendary sorceress conflagration. So that's a lot of new words thrown at you all at once, and on first reading that is completely meaningless. But by the time you finish the book, it should all make a lot more sense. The next main character we meet is a young girl, who has no name to start with, but will come to be known as Sorry. It's not entirely clear what happens to her on first reading, or indeed on future readings. Near as I can figure, she meets an old woman who prophesies that she will go to war and be consumed by darkness before dropping dead. Then she encounters Cotillion and Amanas, 2 enemies of the Empress, who plan to use her for their own ends. You could easily assume that these are the villains of the story, given that they rule over a shadow dimension and command a legion of hellhounds. But there are a bunch of similarly evil-coded characters opposing the Empire throughout the book, and these two spend most of this book just hanging out in the background. And by the end of the book you are left with a distinct feeling that the Malazan Empire might not be the good guys after all, so the whole question of good versus evil is rather moot in this context. Another group of characters are introduced at the Siege of Pale. Tatasale the Mage is the most important. Through her we learn how magic works in this world. Basically, magicians open warrens, which are kind of portals to another dimension, and they can either use them as shortcuts to travel to another place, which is highly dangerous, or channel the power themselves, as long as they're strong enough. This is demonstrated in a big battle scene, where Malazan's mages battle the forces of Anamander Rake, Lord of Moonspawn, which is a cool floating castle. It's the biggest action scene in the book. It is very impressive. There's ravens, explosions, one wizard dies and is reincarnated as a puppet. It's amazing stuff. We also meet the Bridge Burners, another important group of characters. They were favourites of the old emperor, but the new empress is trying to get rid of them by turning them into a suicide squad. These are the most relatable characters we met so far. Just a bunch of regular guys trying to do their jobs and not get killed. Paran comes back into the story here, and is charged by the Empress with hunting down Sorry, who by now has joined the army, shipped off to Genobakis, and joined the Bridge Burners. Once Paran arrives in Pale, he's immediately stabbed by Sorry, and it turns out she is actually being possessed by Cotillion. But he doesn't die. His life is saved by Opon, one of the godlike beings known as Ascendants, who play games with the lives of mortals, for reasons. After this, we finally get to Darujistan, where we meet even more characters. For some, this may be a step too far, but for me, this is where the book really started to click. It feels much more like a traditional fantasy city setting. We mainly follow the patrons of the Phoenix Inn, a motley group of thieves, assassins, and spies, all in the middle of their own stories. If the book had started with these characters, it would probably be a lot easier for people to get into. There's Crocus, the lovelorn young thief, Murillo, the courtier, Ralik Nom, the assassin, and Krupp, the pub boy, who talks of himself in the third person, but his dreams reveal him to have extraordinary but ill-defined powers of his own. All of them work for Baruch the alchemist, who in turn is allied with Anamanda Rake of Moonspawn. So there is a connection to the Malazan plotline, but most of them just go about their business, not really bothered that there's a massive army in the next city along that could come down to conquer them at any minute. So after a few chapters of events in Darujistan, we start to keep putting back to the Malazan characters. The bridge burners are sent there to blow the city up. Paran follows them once he's recovered from his near-death experience, and Tatasale is unexpectedly killed off. But she is reborn in a different form, somehow. So there remains the possibility that she could return in a future volume. Meanwhile, the Empress's deputy, Adjunct Lord, seeks to unleash a Jagat Tyrant on Darujistan. What is a Jagat Tyrant, you may ask? Well, the glossary at the end defines Jagat as a non-human, extinct mythical people. And that's about all the explanation we get. In fact, the glossary is pretty useless. It defines Tistiandi as an elder race, and it defines Talanimas as one of the 4 founding races, now immortal. You really need a lot more information than that to understand what's going on. I'm sure there are online wikis explaining every speck of lore gathered from all the Malazan books published so far, but I'm avoiding them for now, as I don't want to spoil any future books in the series. Everything comes to a head in the final part, with Lady Simtal's fate, as all the characters from both sides come together and their individual subplots are resolved in satisfying fashion. The Jagat Tyrant comes close to destroying the city, but he is stopped by something called a Zath. If you're wondering what a Zath is, join the club. They are never once mentioned in the book before their first appearance, and we get the bare minimum of information about them afterwards. So it is a bit of a Deus Ex Machina, but apart from that, it is a satisfying ending. A bunch of people die, Reek turns into a dragon, there's a magic treehouse. It's crazy stuff, but it definitely leaves you wanting more. So I definitely enjoyed it in the end. There's still a lot about the world and its characters that I don't fully understand, but it's a compelling read, and we're looking forward to carrying on with the sequels. There's 10 books of the main series, plus countless sequels and prequels that are still ongoing. I don't know how much of these I'll end up reading, but I'll definitely carry on with books 2 and 3. And maybe I'll talk about them here if I've got enough to say. So press subscribe if you like the sound of that, and I'll see you next time.